Everybody, welcome to our virtual presentation from the River Falls Public Library tonight. I want to first tell you that this is also not only live, but it's also recorded for later viewing. If you have any questions, you can enter them in the either Facebook page or on our YouTube chat, and we'll try to get them answered at the end. So let me introduce our presenter tonight, Dr. Patty Loew. She's a professor in the Medill School of Journalism and former director of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at Northwestern University, a citizen of the Mashkiiziibii, the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Ojibwe. Dr. Loew is the author of 4 books, including Indian Nations of Wisconsin, Histories of Endurance and Renewal, and I will hold up the books that we have here at the library at the end of the presentation. That book is now in its 2nd edition. Also, Native People of Wisconsin, which is used by 20,000 Wisconsin school children as a social studies text, and Teacher's Guide to Native People of Wisconsin. Her book, 7th Generation Earth Ethics, won the 2014 Midwest Book Award for Culture. Loew has produced many documentaries for public and commercial television, including the award-winning Way of the Warrior, which aired nationally on PBS in 2007 and 2011. For 20 years, she hosted news and public affairs programs, including Weekend and In Wisconsin for PBS Wisconsin. Dr. Loew, a 2019 inductee of the American Academy of Arts and Science and recipient of the Wisconsin 2019 Martin Luther King Jr. Heritage Award, has written extensively about Ojibwe treaty rights, sovereignty, and the role of Native media in communicating Indigenous worldviews. Her documentaries have explored cultural expression and through sports, as well as contemporary resistance to environmental threats. She works extensively with Native youth, teaching digital storytelling skills as a way to grow the next generation of Native storytellers and land stewards. She is a former member of the National Board of Directors for both Unity, Journalists of Color, and the Native American Journalists Association. Prior to her position at Northwestern University, Dr. Loew is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is Professor Emerita, UW Extension, and is an honorary fellow in the Department of Civil Society and Community Studies in the UW-Madison School of Human Ecology. In 2011, Dr. Loew received the Distinguished Alumni Award from UW-La Crosse, and in 2010, Outstanding Women of Color Award from both UW-Madison and the University of Wisconsin System. She holds honorary doctorates from Edgewood and Northland College. Please welcome Dr. Patty Loew.
Thank you, Tanya. I don't think I'm muted. Geez, I feel like that was a eulogy.
Pretty impressive.
I appreciate that. Let's see if we can get this going. Okay. So, do you see?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
There you go.
No, all right. Okay. So, okay. Do you see what I see? Tanya, are you seeing my title page here? Full screen?
Yes, we can see your slide presentation. You're good.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you. First of all, Bonjour. Thank you very much. Hello, for inviting me. And it's always wonderful to be in Wisconsin, even if it's only virtually. And I know that River Falls is in the ancestral lands of the St. Croix Ojibwe and the Lakudere Ojibwe, 2 bands that I have great affection and affinity for. And I'm coming to you from Chicago, which interestingly enough, Jigag is the Ojibwe word for skunk. So I'm coming to you from Skunktown, which is the ancestral lands of the Council of Three Fires. These are the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa people. So I want to talk about 7th generation earth ethics, and thought that I would tell you a little bit about me. You heard probably way too much about me, but my Ojibwe name is Waswa Kanokwe, which means torchlight on the water woman. As Tanya mentioned, I'm a member of the Mashkiiziibii community. Mashkiiziibii is our word for our community. It translates to Medicine River. You know us. Our treaty name is the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, or Ojibwe. I'm a professor in the Medill School of Journalism, and just stepped down after 5 years as the inaugural director for the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. The title of my book, Seventh Generation Earth Ethics, really comes from this principle that Ojibwe and other members of many other tribes have kind of an environmental stewardship principle, which cautions us to make decisions in a way that it is acting in the best possible way for future generations. So we're thinking 7 generations into the future, and some of those really wicked problems in life, climate change, homelessness, poverty, really require long-range thinking. There was also at one time an effort to introduce a 7th generation amendment, which read that the right of citizens of the United States to use and enjoy air, water, wildlife, and other renewable resources determined by the Congress to be common property shall not be impaired, nor shall such use impair their availability for the use of future generations. So really, it is asking people in our generation to sacrifice, to make sure that we have resources available for future generations. The book was organized, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and move on to some other things, but this was kind of my jumping off place. When I wrote my first book, which is Indian Nations of Wisconsin, Histories of Endurance and Renewal, I started with oral history, and I met people in each of the 12 communities, Native communities in Wisconsin, culture keepers, medicine people, tribal historic preservation officers, educators, and asked them, where I needed to go to write a story that wasn't. I didn't want it. If you go to any library and you go to the E990 section, you will see literally tens of thousands of books about Native people that purport to be histories. Really, very few of them are actually written by Native Americans. They're usually books about Native Americans written by missionaries, government officials, traders, and I think they're better histories of those people than they are of Native people. So I really wanted to privilege non-print sources for my history book. I wanted it to be different. So I looked at oral history, at songs, dances, pictographs, petroglyphs, basket weavings, powwow regalia, wampum belts. And that's the way I constructed the histories of the tribal nations. And I worked in collaboration with people. And I kept thinking as I was meeting all these amazing people, geez, somebody ought to write a biography of this person. And this guy is really interesting. Somebody should write a book about him. And I thought, well, I don't see those books being written, so what the heck, I'm going to write it. So I chose one biography from each of the 12 Native communities, and I really looked for people whose life stories spoke to larger community histories. And I realized that environmentalism was actually too narrow, that sustainability was a better organizing principle. So here are a few of the individuals who have inspired me. I'm not going to talk about all 12, but I want to introduce you to some of the people that I was just so impressed with. One of them is Walt Brissett, who was a co-founder of the Lake Superior Greens, the Wisconsin Greens. He founded, I think, almost 24 community groups, political groups, social groups, art movements, and he was an author. He was a communication specialist for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. He became an outspoken advocate for Ojibwe treaty rights during the a pretty violent chapter of Wisconsin's history in the late 80s and early 90s. And this picture of him on the right here was during a protest of, it was in 1995, and Wisconsin Central and Southern Railroad was carrying it was a white train that was carrying toxic chemicals to a closed down mine in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which had been primarily a copper mine that had operated for about 40 years. And it had closed down, and somebody bought the mine and got the okay from the Environmental Protection Agency to reopen the mine as a leach mine, which basically is to take cyanide and arsenic and really nasty chemicals, mix it with water, and flush it into these old shafts. And this toxic soup is so toxic that it dissolves the rock and leaves trace minerals behind. So this train was carrying those chemicals, and there were a number of Bad River Ogichida, that's our word for warriors, who met the train at our borders and closed the track down. Our railroad tracks hadn't been updated since the 1950s, and there was a real concern about the possibility of a train derailment and some of these railroad trestles over the river that feeds our wild rice beds, so rusted out you could shake somebody's hand through some of these rust holes. And what was really interesting was while this was going on, I think it was in Wyowega, there was the same railroad company had experienced a train derailment, and there were a number of cars that went into the river, and I think some of the cars were carrying something like ammonium nitrate, a farm chemical, and there was explosions, and the community was evacuated. And so, in looking at it within a larger context, you could really argue that these Ogichida knew what they were doing. Then there were people like Franny Van Zyl from Mole Lake, who was an anti-mine activist when Exxon wanted to build what would have been one of North America's largest sulfide mines at Crandon. And she and her significant other, Fred Ackley, led the community resistance to the mine. And it was really interesting because Exxon at the time was kind of the perfect boogeyman, because it had one of its other subsidiaries was involved in oil and natural gas. And some of you may remember the Exxon Valdez, which dumped, I don't know how many millions of gallons of oil into Prince William Sound in Alaska, ruined the fishery for years and years and years. And Exxon eventually gave, I think it sold the mine to Rio Algom, which sold the mine to Billiton, which sold the mine to another Australian company. It was kind of a hot potato for a while. And eventually, the two closest Indian reservations, the Mole Lake Ojibwe and the Forest County Potawatomi, bought the mine site in order to prevent it from being mined. The reason Franny Van Zyl was so adamant against the mine is it was not even 1,600 feet from Rice Lake, which was one of the last inland wild rice producing lakes in northern Wisconsin, and I mean where the whole lake was filled with rice. And later, when my tribe was threatened by what would have been a 22-mile long open pit taconite mine at the headwaters of our rice river, Franny and Fred came out. They came out of anti-mine retirement and went to the Wisconsin Capitol and led a group of native, non-native environmental group coalition that lobbied against the Gogebic taconite mine, and the mine was never built. Then there was my mentor, Joe Rose at Bad River, who was one of the most remarkable men that I have ever met. I've told more than one person that if I knew that there was going to be some kind of a global disaster and only 10% of the people were going to survive, I would head to Joe Rose's place, because he just knew everything. He was a medicine man. He knew the plants and medicines. He knew how to build shelters that would keep somebody alive at 35 below zero temperatures. He could build rustic ovens. He taught science at Northland College. He was the director of Native American Studies there. He was Bad River's representative to the Void Intertribal Task Force. This was a group that safeguarded Ojibwe treaty rights, and another anti-mine activist. There was Hillary Sparky Wakaw, who from the Menominee Nation served as a county board supervisor, another anti-mine activist. And when at one time the Wolf River batholith was being considered, it was on the short list to house a high-level nuclear to house, store high-level nuclear waste. And he quietly, one part of the Wolf River had an outstanding resource waters designation, which meant that anything going into the river had to be 100% clean. And of course, mine waste and nuclear storage can't meet that high of a standard. And so he was able to get that same status for the other part of the river, which meant that the Wolf River batholith was not suitable to house that kind of nuclear waste. Jenny and Mary Thunder are really interesting women. They were ministering to people and delivering babies and providing relief, medical relief, to people who were suffering from TB at the turn of the century up through the 1930s, traveling between the Forest County Potawatomi community, because it wasn't a reservation at that time, to Mole Lake on snowshoes and delivering babies. And there's this story about them. You know how in the old days your meat used to come from the butcher with wrapped in paper, and then it would have kind of twine string that would that the paper would be tied in, the bundle would be tied in. They would save that string and fry it in a frying pan to sterilize it, and that was what was used to tie off a baby's umbilical cord. Just really doing wise things and literally operating under the most difficult circumstances. And what I think is just really precious is the the Potawatomi dedicated their beautiful health clinic to these two extraordinary women. And then there was Truman Loew, no relation. Of course, he spells his name differently. A Ho-Chunk artist who I think the Capital Times called him the most prolific and greatest artist from Wisconsin that nobody has ever heard of. Of course, the Ho-Chunk and people in the University of Wisconsin system know him. He was an art professor at UW-Madison, but he did these large environmental pieces. He has sculptures in the Rose Garden at the White House. He has exhibition at the National Gallery in Canada. This piece here in the middle, I don't know if you can see my cursor, just to the left of his portrait, is this incredibly moving, large installation to commemorate. You can see the stems of the branches, thin branches of trees, but there are small red dots periodically, and it was to commemorate a smallpox epidemic, I think in 1915, that raged through the Ho-Chunk community. His pieces are really moving, and he didn't work in birch because he knew that birch was endangered and he wanted to save it for the birch bark craftspeople in the Upper Great Lakes region. So these were some of the people that really inspired me. When we talk about earth ethics, the flip side of that is this willingness to allow certain areas to become sacrifice zones. A sacrifice zone is a geographic area that has been permanently impaired by environmental damage or economic disinvestment. It's loosely used to describe marginalized places that bear the burdens of the industrial economy, purportedly to benefit society overall as measured by abstract notions of progress or development. That's a definition that comes from Mulvaney in a book about solar power. So here's some examples. The top, we have Alberta tar sands. This is an area that is the size of Florida, I think, with some of the dirtiest energy production on the planet. Crude oil is that occurs naturally in the sands of this area is pulled out, piped to places like Minnesota and Wisconsin. Well, it's piped through places like Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, and then the pipe returns it to Canada. Black Mesa coal mining in the Four Corners region of the West, the legacy of uranium mining in Navajo country. These are, when I talk about sacrifice zones, this is what I'm talking about. We as a society have agreed that that it's worth it to allow the environmental degradation to benefit society as a whole, but the consequences for the indigenous people that inhabit these areas is astronomically horrible. The tar sands, Fort Chippewa Dene people that live downstream from this, who have fished the Athabascan lakes and river areas, now are pulling up fish with, 2 heads and tumors, and people are contracting these very rare kinds of cancers that are clearly medically associated with petroleum products. And they're experiencing cancer rates that are 10 times higher than they should be relative to their population. So at Bad River, we had a proposed 22-mile long. It was a 3-stage project. The first phase was 4 miles, but if it had been if the mine actually would have been operating, it would have eventually been 2 miles long, 1.5 miles deep, and 2 miles wide. It didn't happen. Most taconite is a very low grade of iron that is usually put into pellets, and then much of it is exported to China. The bottom fell out of the prices, and Gogebeck pulled out of the project, but it still owns the leases and could come back. But this is what this picture here is of Hibbing, a taconite mine that is only 3 miles wide, and it looks like a moonscape. Nothing grows there. It's there are no plants and animals, and this is what the people of Bad River are really worried that their environment would look like. And then there's Enbridge Line 5, which is our current struggle. This is, again, carrying that the tar sands from Alberta down. Line 3 takes it to Superior. Line 5 picks it up and takes it through Wisconsin across our reservation land. I mean, this is not like the Dakota Access Pipeline where there was disputed ceded treaty land. This is clearly on our sovereign land. The leases expired in 2013. We asked Gogebeck, we asked Enbridge to stop the flow, dig up the pipe, remediate the land, and it refused. And just recently, last month, a federal judge agreed that while the company had violated our sovereignty, and it needed to provide restitution, that he would allow the pipe to continue to operate because it would be too disruptive to Canada and American energy consumers, and it would threaten a 1977 treaty between Canada and the U.S. Regarding oil. So the judge and the federal government in Canada has decided that Bad River, they're willing to let Bad River be a sacrifice zone. The pipe is 645 miles long. It's a 30-inch pipe, which is very small by pipeline standards. It's carrying 2.3 million gallons of crude oil per day. It was built in 1953 with a 50-year life expectancy. I'm not a math major, but I know that it's way past its due date. And this is a pipe that crosses rivers and wetlands, culturally significant sites. Because of flooding and climate change, parts of the pipe are exposed. But where it really gets scary is as it crosses from Michigan. Well, it crosses the Straits of Mackinac. And I want to show you an excerpt from a documentary called The Dirty Secret at the Bottom of the Great Lakes, Oil and Water. So I hope you're going to be able to hear this.
Enbridge has an extensive pipeline network running through the Great Lakes region, and one pipeline in particular running through the Great Lakes themselves. Line 5 travels from Superior, Wisconsin through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then splits into two 20-inch pipelines as it crosses the 5-mile wide strait between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The twin pipelines follow the contours of the lake bottom, reaching depths of over 200 feet.
It's 61 years old. It's never been replaced. It's owned and operated by Enbridge, which is the same company responsible for the largest oil spill in history. So you've got the iconic image of the Great Lakes, and right almost directly underneath it, there's this ticking time bomb.
This is what an oil spill would look like in the Straits of Mackinac. The colored dots show where the oil would travel within the lake's water table, Red is near surface, yellow mid-depth, blue near bottom. The oil would travel far, fast, and in different directions.
Already, after 6 days, these surface particles are down heading into Rogers City, 40 miles away from the straits.
Dave Schwab, a research scientist at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, created the computer models. I met with him to find out why the straits were especially vulnerable to an oil spill. It's just this picture where it really spreads out there. I mean, you couldn't run enough oil boom across the universe.
And that's a consequence of this oscillating flow that's so powerful. The amount of water going through that strait when it's going one direction or the other at the peak is more than 10 times what goes over Niagara Falls.
If only one of the aging pipelines in the Straits of Mackinac were to rupture and Enbridge was able to shut down the pipeline immediately, the best case scenario would be a 1.5 million gallon oil spill.
We could find out very little about the pipeline. We just basically knew it was there. The age. When was this line last inspected? What were the results of that inspection? That's basic information the public should have. We cannot get. We had filed 2 FOIAs that were ignored for the large part. The FOIAs were asking for inspections. We know that Enbridge went down and took footage, but they weren't releasing the footage. And we weren't getting it from the federal agency, PHMSA. Finally, we decided we're going to just dive it. And when we got out there, it was shocking.
National Wildlife Federation divers captured footage of what many fear.
He's in the water.
Broken structural braces, and the pipelines covered in debris. But as the crew lowered their cameras deeper than they were able to dive, what they captured was truly worrisome. Sections of pipeline completely unsupported at a depth of over 200 feet. Enbridge has an
So that's what we're really concerned about. Here's its path. One of the concerns now, a federal judge also denied Michigan, the state of Michigan filed suit, and again, a federal judge sided with the company. And so now what the plan is, well, this is Enbridge Line 3. Well, I thought I had a different slide there. Now the plan is to build a tunnel, and encase the pipe in this large tunnel that workers could could walk through and fix any problem. And because Bad River won't allow the company to have the pipe bisect our reservation as it does now, the plan is to go around our reservation. But if you know the geology of the area, everything drains north into Lake Superior. There's these hundreds of millions of years old rocks that are stacked on top of each other, and then they just kind of tip toward Lake Superior. So if there's a spill off the reservation, it will still affect us. So that's not a solution that we find very agreeable. It's at the heart of all of this is tribal sovereignty. And oftentimes we just don't learn this in school. We learn federal, state, municipal governments, but we don't understand that there are tribal governments and that these governments are sovereign as well. Limited somewhat by the federal government, but still sovereign. So here are some of the approaches that the tribes are taking to defend their environments, and steps are taking to try to avoid becoming a sacrifice zone. There's NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This is a legal act that protects burial sites or cultural artifacts that are excavated, let's say, on federal or tribal lands, highways, for example. It also sets up a process to return cultural items held by public institutions to Native nations. Any university, any public museum, like the Field Museum, which has 150,000 artifacts, if a museum or university can't show provenance, paperwork that shows that that item was acquired legally, and they have to create an inventory, share it with the tribe that they believe that artifact is connected to. It's a process for that tribe to get that artifact back. And it sets up penalties for trafficking in human remains. So this is a legal tool that tribes use. Treatment as a state or treatment as a sovereign status. This is little known language in the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts from the 1970s. And it reads that regulatory authority, including over non-Indians on a reservation, may be delegated to an Indian nation under the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. This is a really onerous process. It took my tribe 10 years to get TAS for water and air. You have to show that you have the equipment to do this. You have to show that you have the intellectual know-how, the scientific know-how, and it is quite an onerous process. But it allows tribes to set their own standards for air and water quality, which often exceed the states in which they reside. Those regulations can't be higher than the federal government, but they do often exceed the states, and it sets up this tension. And often, it results, as it did with the state of Wisconsin and a number of tribes. The tribes would apply for TAS status. The state of Wisconsin would try to get an injunction in a court to keep them from getting that, because it was concerned about its own sovereignty and wanted to be the one that controlled what industries settled in Wisconsin, whether they met the tribal notion of a sustainable development or not. An Indian nation with TAS is treated the same as a state for purposes of the Clean Air and Water Act. And an Indian nation with TAS takes authority for all delegable portions of the act or for certain sections. So if you're a non-Indian and you're living on an Indian reservation on allotted land, and please Google allotment, the General Allotment Act, it's too complicated to go into, but quite simply, this was an act, Congress wanted to assimilate Indian people, and so it privatized our land in 1887. Most tribal lands, not all, but most of them, all but the Menominee in Wisconsin. So it privatized the land, allotted it into 80 or 90 acre parcels, and distributed it to tribal members, and then made the excess, whatever land was left. This was land that became homestead land and offered free or at ridiculously low prices to white European settlers, with this idea that Native people would become farmers and be assimilated. So because of that, a lot of, there are, the Oneida, for example, lost 98% of their land through the allotment process. My tribe, we were a little bit more isolated. We didn't have an airport or a port. Our land wasn't considered as valuable. We only lost 60% of our land. So there are lots of non-Indians living within the original borders of an Indian reservation. So if you're living on a reservation, and let's say your septic tank fails, the tribal government can say, we want you to put in a new septic system, environmentally friendly mound system. And you say, well, that's going to cost me $40,000. I'm not going to do it. The tribe has the authority to tell you you can't do it. But I think we all live in fear of the notion of taxation without representation, especially in the current climate of the U.S. Supreme Court. So I don't think any of those kind of cases are going to wind up being litigated. This is really an interesting approach. It's the rights of nature movement. It acknowledges that nature in all its life forms has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. And it's a movement that started in Ecuador. And Ecuador has a constitutional amendment protecting the rights of nature. New Zealand, a couple of years ago, granted, and that's always kind of an awkward word, acknowledged, I think would be a better word, but it granted personhood to the Wanganui River, which is a river sacred to the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. Australia did something similar for the First Nations people of Australia. The White Earth Anishinaabe acknowledged personhood for wild rice, and again, understood and acknowledged the rights of wild rice to persist and exist. The Ho-Chunk Nation is considering an ordinance, but it's not just Native nations that are looking at the rights of nature and thinking about it more seriously. The Toledo City Council actually passed an ordinance acknowledging personhood and the rights of Lake Erie, which at one point, I think it was in the 70s, caught fire. A federal judge threw it out, but it just, I think, punctuates the fact that this is a movement that it's happening around the globe, and more people are thinking about the rights of nature. I'm thinking about it because I'm teaching the very last class of my academic career, and my class and I are reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Breeding Sweetgrass, which is, in my estimation, the most beautiful, important book that's been written in my lifetime. And one of the things she asks at one point that I think about all the time, she said, a lot of us talk about how much we love nature. We love walks on the beach. We love, hiking and enjoying a forest. What if we truly believed that nature loved us back? How would that change the way we think? How would it change the way we behave? And in one of her last essays in the book, she writes, she's talking about the damage that human beings have done to the planet, and how upsetting and sorrowful it is for the indigenous people of those places, and not just indigenous people. I mean, I think our young people are really concerned about climate change, and they're really concerned about the devastation that we've done to this planet. And her last statement is just so beautiful and so hopeful. And so I added it in at the last minute because my students reminded me of how important it was. She writes, if grief can be a doorway to love, and she's talking about the grief that we're experiencing when we see what we've done to this planet. If grief can be a doorway to love, then let us all weep for the world we are breaking apart so that we can love it back to wholeness again. Oh, almost makes me want to cry. I think it's just one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. And so did my students. So I think that's a good way to stop and see if there are any questions. And I'm
back.
Oh, okay. All right. All right.
I'm hoping, I'm not able to see any postings on Facebook right now, but we have Kim Kiskinen on technology support here, and she will enter any questions that may be there.
Okay.
So I kind of think there's a group around here that's reading Braiding Sweetgrass, maybe a church group. maybe Unitarian Church group. I'm not certain, but we do have the braiding sweetgrass here at our library, and it is checked out, and it's actually checked out at quite a few of our sister libraries. So it must be a big deal, and now I'm not going to have to read that book too. It sounds very
It's
spiritual. I mean, Native American spiritual. I don't want to.
It's so beautiful. It's Robin Robin Kimmerer is a citizen band Potawatomi woman who teaches. She's an environmental scientist and teaches at SUNY in Syracuse, and she runs an environmental institute. And her she was a postdoc fellow at the University of Wisconsin and wrote this book, which is now it's number 2 on the New York Times best-selling list for paperback nonfiction, and it's been on the list for 135 weeks. That's how. And she wrote it in 2017, and it's been kind of building, and by word of mouth, it's this book that people are now sharing, and it's just interesting that in almost 2023. 6 years after she wrote the book, it's still on the New York Times bestseller list. And she writes, she takes science and social observations and braids them into her sort of cultural take, informed by her Potawatomi background, and talks about what we can learn from plants in the most beautiful way. It's hard to describe how beautiful this book is. It's filled with gratitude and humility and this awareness. She begins by talking about how when she went to college, she was really interested in science. That was her first love. And when she was asked, why do you want to be a scientist? And she said, I want to know why, asters and goldenrods grow together, purple and gold. I see it in my landscape around my house. And I'm wondering why these two plants grow together. And the admissions officer said, you don't want science, you want art. That's a couple of doors down. And luckily for all of us who love this book, she didn't listen to him and she continued her pursuit of science. But there's such poetry in the way her prose is poetic. And she has this just beautiful kind of take on life, and as evidenced by this really profound question that she asks in one of her essays, what if nature loved us back? What if we believed that nature loved us back? Would we still harvest trees? Yeah, but Native people have this, in my culture, before you pick your berries, you put tobacco down as an offering. We believe that asemar, this it's medicinal tobacco, is the smoke carries our prayers up to the Creator. So before we harvest berries, we put tobacco down. Before we spear fish, we put tobacco in the water. Before we take a deer, or after we take a deer, we put tobacco down and thank that animal or that plant for giving up its life for us. It's just if we believe that nature loves us back, we show gratitude and we understand that we are part of it. We're not above it. We're part of it. We have obligations to it and it has obligations to us. There's a reciprocal kind of relationship. It's really beautiful.
It is. So, what's ironic, I have aster and goldenrod growing together at my cabin, and we're on the Wolf River in Shawano. That's where our cabin is. And that river is also full of wild rice. Can you tell me what that wild rice means to Native people? I don't expect you to be an expert on everything here, but you seem to be pretty much.
Well, Manoman is the word, the Algonquin word for rice, Manoman. It means good berry. And actually, wild rice is not a rice, it's an aquatic grass. And there's lake wild rice and there's river wild rice. It's a different species, but still edible. And the Menominee, I mean, it's in their name. And when the Menominee traveled, they would say that where the Menominee goes, the wild rice follows, because Menominee, when they moved their villages, would actually pack wild rice in wet mud and carry it with them and reseed or newly seed an area. For us, wild rice is at the essence of who we are as Ojibwe people. Our migration story has us at one point, whether we were in the Great Lakes region originally or came back here, at one point we're living on the shores of the Great Salt Sea, but we know that our homes are west in the Upper Great Lakes region. And there's a crisis, and people turn to prophecies and remember that at one time we lived west, and that it was time for us to return to our homes where the food grows on water. And for us, the prophecies told us that there were 7 stopping places, and there's archaeological evidence to support this, migration, that this migration really happened. Not that I think that a deep native cultural story needs Western scientific, the seal of approval, but there is archaeological evidence for this as well. So, there's a place of thundering water, which is Niagara Falls. There's a turtle-shaped island. There's a place of great medicine, Manitoulin Island. There's a place of shallow water where you could almost walk across the backs of the salmon because the salmon are so plentiful. There's a place where the river cuts through the land like a knife. That's the Detroit River. There's another turtle-shaped island, and then the people get to Lake Superior, and the Odawa, I mentioned the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. We've shared the same language, basically, and the same cultural stories, and we feel like we're Confederates. So we get to Lake Superior. The Odawa go north around the northern part of Lake Superior. The Ojibwe take the middle route along the south shore of Lake Superior, and the Potawatomi follow Lake Michigan down to Chicago. We all find wild rice, and so we're where we're supposed to be. We've come back to the area where the food grows on water. And if you look at how that informed who we became as we resettled the area and as we encountered settlers from Europe, in our treaties, you look at the treaties, we're one of the few tribes that, we were coerced to sell our land, but we reserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather rice upon the water. You see that language in all of our treaties, and not just on our reservations, but in the land that we were forced to give up. You see that in the lawsuits that are trying to protect the wild rice even today. My tribe has sued Enbridge because we're trying to protect the wild rice. We have 850 acres of wild rice along the south shore of Lake Superior in Chequamegon, next to Chequamegon Bay. These are the lungs of Lake Superior. Wild rice is an indicator species. It tells you whether you have a clean environment. And I know I'm going on too long on this one question, but it's such an important question.
So it's a sign of healthy water.
It's a sign of healthy water. it feeds the fish, it feeds the insects, it feeds the birds, migrating birds, mammals. There's a really cute picture, a video on Facebook of a mother bear and a cub in our wild rice, just having a wonderful time. And our tribal chair is in a boat, and he's saying "Bonjour Makwa," which is hello bear. And the mother bear kind of pops up. It's almost like she's saying hello to the people in the boat. But if you have wild rice, it filters the water, it feeds everything, including human beings. It's this beautiful, beautiful plant that the Creator has given us, and we're where we're supposed to be, and we're sworn to protect it. And that includes, contemporary lawsuits.
There are a lot of birds that like to nest in that rice too.
Absolutely.
Incredible. They just can make a lot of noise. It's like you can't even see them, but you can hear them. And then if you get too close, whoof, they all go up.
So many sandhill cranes and blue herons and eagles. I mean, if you ever get a chance to visit our wild rice beds, it looks sort of like the Florida Everglades. If you take out the cypress and put in willow, where you can just get lost because it's just rice on all sides of you in these narrow channels with, that interconnect, and it's amazing.
So I think, there's so much to learn from from your presentation, and there's a lot of environmental concerns, but I think let's end this with the thoughts that, what if nature loved us back? And I really like that. I want to thank you for presenting to us and making us smarter today, and
You're
thank
so
our
welcome.
audience for being here. I also want to mention that our next program is after Thanksgiving, Wednesday, November 30th. Can fashion be sustainable? What innovation looks like in a global apparel industry?
Oh, good topic.
Yes, I think that one's going to be very good. And then we have a winter solstice community sing on December 21st. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
It was my
Good night,
pleasure.
everybody.